Hello everyone, this is Alan G., your host of True Crime Man's Dark Imagination. If you like what you see, hit the like button, subscribe, and hit the bell so that you'll be notified of any future episodes. We've brought you many stories about those evil beings that swindle trusting souls for money, and then reward them with their untimely deaths. Others, like the subject of this presentation, became very proud of their work. So proud, in fact, that they began to make mistakes, and those mistakes cost them their freedom or their lives. Just before dawn of a Monday, early in July 1895, a middle-aged man appeared at the bank of the Ohio River near Wheeling, West Virginia, and set a bulging gunny sack on the ground. His face boasted side whiskers, a chinned beard, and a mustache. He wore a derby. Behind a pair of gold-rimmed spectacles stared light blue eyes, the light distinguished by a drooping lid. His teeth, as described by one of his admirers, were large and well kept. The man removed his derby, looked around cautiously. Satisfied that he was alone, he began to undress. After stripping down to the bare skin, he made a neat pile of his clothes and placed a suicide note on top. Then, to make sure the police would know beyond any reasonable doubt who had done himself in, he put an old silver pocket watch of German make, with his photograph inside the lid, on top of the note and the clothes. Now, gunny sack in hand, he walked barefoot into the river, leaving his footprints in the mud right down to the water's edge. He wanted the police to be absolutely certain that he drowned himself. Once in the water, however, he turned north and walked 50 yards upstream to a pile of rocks where he had previously cached a spare suit of clothes and a boat. He dropped the gunny sack into the boat, dressed, shoved the boat into the water, and started rowing across the Ohio River. When he was halfway across, he shipped his oars and let the boat drift. Then he dumped the contents of his sack, letting, we must be blunt, the entrails of a human female, riddled with arsenic, slide beneath the surface of the dirty water to settle to the bottom. Then he picked up his oars again, heading for a deserted stretch of bank above Martin's Ferry on the Ohio side of the river. As he disappeared into the midst, he was confident that he had successfully covered the tracks of still another astonishing number of murders. Who was the killer? He had been in turn Jacob Schmidt, Johann Hoch, Albert Huschberg, Count Otto von Kain, Jacob Erdorf, Henry Martels, Dr. L. G. Hart, Martin Dotes, Jacob Deuce, C. A. Meyer, H. Frick, Dr. James, C. A. Calford, Jacob Witt, DeWitt C. Cudahy, Henry F. Hartman, John C. O. Schultz, and Heinrich Walzen, and many others besides. He was ultimately known to the police, the newspaper readers at the time, and the families of his victims as Johann Hoch. He was the American Bluebeard, the equal of anything England, France, or Germany has produced in the highly specialized field of classic crime. Right up to the moment when, but we will come to the climax later. In his specialty, wife murder, Hoch apparently never wasted time. On the very night, January 12, 1905, that his penultimate victim had breathed her last in an upstairs bedroom at 6034 Union Avenue in Chicago, the killer was downstairs in the kitchen courting her sister, whom he married 4 days later. The event was not unique in his career. Over a span of 18 years, he married between 43 and 50 women, about a third of whom he murdered with systematic doses of arsenic. The exact number of his victims cannot be determined. His operations were too complex, his victims too many, and too often permanently silenced. The trail he left too obscure, and his own version of the events too contradictory for an exact total to be compiled. In terms of technique, Johann Hoche was a German-American counterpart of Landru, the Frenchman who seduced and murdered lonely middle-aged women who answered his matrimonial advertisements in Paris newspapers in the years 1915 to 1919. In terms of his attitudes toward the opposite sex, Hoche was a male Belle Gunness, as untouched by the dismal fate of his victims as Belle was by the sordid end of the string of husbands she slaughtered in her cellar abattoir at La Porte, Indiana, around 1905. In terms of number of victims, Hoche was almost a peer of H. Holmes, the dandy who asphyxiated or strangled an estimated 50 women in his multi-roomed crematory and murder castle in Chicago in the years 1892 to 1894. For a little more than a decade, Johann Hoche married, swindled, and either abandoned or murdered his victims with time clock regularity without arousing the curiosity or interest of anybody at all. The first man to peel back a few of the layers of the fake personality and catch a glimpse of the killer underneath was, strangely enough, a mild-mannered clergyman, the pastor of St. Matthew's German Lutheran Church in Wheeling in 1895. Early in February of that year, the perambulating merchant of death turned up in Wheeling, posing as a wealthy man named Jacob Huff. He opened up a saloon at 4728 Jacob Street where he catered to the local German immigrant population with beer, spirited zither playing, and an odd country delivery of Heidelberg drinking songs. If he had stuck to the saloon keeping, Hall's path would no doubt never have crossed that of the Reverend Herman C.A. Haas, a local parson. What got the publican in trouble with the parson was his unconcealed talent with the ladies, especially with well-heeled German-speaking widows who were members of Haas's congregation. Huff's romantic technique was of the scattershot variety. He proposed marriage to just about every wealthy widow in the neighborhood. He wants to settle down, one of his Hausfrau parishioners telling him. He said he needs a woman to care for his home, she continued, and he said he would be willing to provide for me. To each of the widows who came to him for advice, Haas suggested caution. He distrusted Hull and urged delay until the stranger was better known. In spite of the minister's opposition, Hull was a quick success. Mrs. Caroline Hoche, a widow with a nice house, $900 in the bank, an insurance policy for $2,500 on her life, and a mind of her own, decided to take the plunge. It was an old story, really. If she waited too long, Mrs. Hoche no doubt reasoned she would lose her ardent suitor to one of the other widows of the congregation, and then where would she be? On April 18, 1895, the Reverend Mr. Haas reluctantly performed the marriage ceremony. Hull moved into the widow's house right after the wedding. In short order, the widow, who had been a plump, healthy beauty all her life, was stricken ill and took to her bed. She got worse fast. On June 14, 1895, Haas was summoned to the sick room, where he watched Huff give his wife a white powder. To his now suspicious mind, it seemed that the widow was afraid of her husband and took the powdered medication with reluctance. By the time he left the sick room, he was convinced that the saloon keeper was poisoning his wife. But he needed proof. How and where was he to get it before it was too late? The pastor stewed over his problem for a few days. He considered going to the Wheeling police, but there was always the possibility he might be wrong. The widow's illness might be perfectly legitimate, and a false accusation would only hurt the parson's reputation, but would also be an unpardonable sin against an innocent man. What he needed before he took any overt action was professional advice from somebody who could tell what was actually ailing the widow. Haas turned to a young local physician, Dr. Gregory Ackerman. He took the doctor back to the sick room with him, only to run into resistance. Huff hovered over his wife like a jealous rooster. She was already under medical care, he maintained. Dr. Ford is treating her, he said. Ackerman hesitated, for there was a matter of professional ethics involved. He had no right to interfere in Dr. Ford's case without the specific request of that physician. Ackerman bowed himself out of the sick room and out of the case. 10 years later, when he described his visit in an interview with the New York American, he made medical ethics look foolish in many eyes. The woman, he said, had been dying when he saw her. Her hands were swollen and her stomach distended. She vomited continually. Either she had peritonitis or she had been poisoned. But Dr. Ford was the regular attending physician, and that meant Ackerman could not interfere. At 3 o'clock in the morning following Ackerman's visit, the widow died. 2 hours later, Haas was notified that Mrs. Huff was dead. When he reached the widow's house at 8 a.m., he found the body unattended. Thoroughly indignant, he scoured the town until he found Huff in a barber shop. The bereaved took one look at a furious parson and began to weep. But the minister's suspicions were not allayed. By early afternoon of the following day, Mrs. Huff had been buried at Redmen Cemetery on the outskirts of Wheeling, and shortly thereafter Haas began an investigation. Soon he learned that Hull had been in financial trouble. The saloon keeper was heavily in debt to a brewery, and the saloon had been shut down. Now Haas concentrated on the white powder medication. Where did Huff get it? What was it? The pastor methodically visited all the drugstores in Wheeling and found that Huff had bought no prescriptions to be filled. Dr. H.T. Ford, the attending physician, had not written any. He had believed that the widow was suffering from nephritis, a disease of the kidneys, for which there was no treatment. Pastor Haas next made a surreptitious trip to the sick room to see if he could get a sample of the white powder for analysis. He found that all traces of it had disappeared. For the first time, it occurred to him that Hull was aware of his suspicions and was taking steps to cover his trail. At about this time, the pastor fell ill, but by the second Sunday following Mrs. Huff's death, he was up and around again. That same day, while at dinner with his wife, he heard a noise in his bedroom, directly over the dining room. Rushing upstairs, he found Hull in his room. The pastor asked for an explanation for his strange visitation. Huff replied weakly that he had been looking for the pastor in order to have a talk with him, but it could wait. Why the bedroom? Why so furtive? Huff backed out of the room without saying, and that was the last Haas saw of him. Fearing that Huff might have tampered with his own bottles of medicine, in open view over the fireplace in the bedroom, the minister emptied the bottles down the drain and immediately regretted it. Of course, it would have been wiser to have had their contents analyzed. The next day, Pastor Haas learned just how uncomfortably warm his investigation had been making it for the saloon keeper. He was notified by the Wheeling police that they had found Hull's clothes, his derby, an old German silver pocket watch with his picture in it, and a suicide note he had written on the banks of the Ohio. Footprints led down to the water. Evidently he had committed suicide, the police said, in a fit of depression over his wife's death. For 2 days, the police dragged the river at the point where Hull had left his clothes, but they found nothing. During this time, it was discovered that Mrs. Hull's grave had been tampered with. Nobody could figure out why, and the matter was soon forgotten. The explanation for the opening and the dosing of the grave would not become apparent for almost 3 years. Just 1 week after Huff's supposed suicide, a drummer in religious circles called on Haas and told the pastor that he had seen Huff, or Johann Hock, as he was now calling himself, very much alive on the other side the river in Janesville, Ohio, with a middle-aged woman on his arm. The pastor sent a description of Hoke to the Janesville police and warned that he was dangerous and a swindler, but there was no reply. The use of the name Johann Hock demonstrated a curious side of the killer's personality. He had a penchant for adopting an alias of the name of the deceased husband of the widow he had most recently married and murdered or abandoned. From the moment when he knew that Hock was still alive, the parson stuck to his trail like a bloodhound. Haas was a devoted reader of newspapers, both English and German. He was a fine print man and took a professional interest in the columns of the newspaper normally skipped over by the casual reader, the obituaries and routine birth and marriage notices. Thus, as time went by, he frequently thought he caught sight of his quarry fitting in and out of the newspaper columns when he married under a recognizable name, when a former widow suddenly died and her husband disappeared, or when a husband abandoned his wife shortly after the marriage ceremony with all of her portable assets except for her whalebone corset. In the course of his meticulous scanning of the many newspapers he subscribed to, the parson spotted an item about one Otto Hock, who had married a woman in Dayton, Ohio, and deserted her a few days later, taking her savings. In 1897, he scissored out a clipping describing the mysterious death in Cincinnati of a Mrs. Clara Bartles, who lasted for 3 months after her marriage to Pudgy, zither-playing John Schmidt. Parson Haas next found a 3-line item in a German-language newspaper describing a Jacob Otto Hock who married in Milwaukee. This time, the minister fired off a letter to the police of that city, but Hoke had already absconded, leaving one wife dead and another swindled out of her savings. It would have been difficult even for Scotland Yard to have kept a perfect scorecard on Johann Hock in the years 1895 to 98. The parson missed a Mrs. Janet Spencer of Chicago, who had married and lost $700 to C.A. Calvert 2 months after the wedding late in 1895. He did not hear of Mrs. Minnie Rankin, who married a Mr. Warnicki in January 1897. No word reached him of Callie Charlotte Andrews, who was deserted 2 hours after the nuptial ceremony in 1897 by one DeWitt C. Cudney and $500. And there were many others. In 1898, Haas's newspaper detective work finally began to pay off. He found his man, or one just like him, in between wives in Chicago. According to the newspaper accounts, the Chicago police had collared a man who claimed his name was Martin Dotes. He had been arrested on 2 counts, one of bigamy and the other having swindled F.J. Magerstadt, a Chicago used furniture dealer, out of some merchandise. What caught the minister's sharp eye was the physical description of the culprit: his height, weight, beard, side whiskers, mustache, drooping left eyelid, and large teeth, all of which tallied exactly. Haas now wrote at once to Captain Luke Colleran, chief of detectives of the Chicago police. The pastor said he believed the man the police were holding was the very same suspect who murdered Carolyn Hock in Wheeling. Would the police check their prisoner against the photograph he was enclosing? It was a copy of the picture the killer left behind in the pocket watch. The pastor's letter and the picture were turned over to Inspector George Shippey, who confronted Hoke with the photograph. Hoke admitted it was his picture without realizing he was incriminating himself. He denied, however, that he had ever been in Wheeling. The inspector next visited the businessman who had brought charges against Hoke. Magerstadt had furnished Hoke's new hats after several of his marriages. His records went back to June 1891, when Hoke had married under the name of H. Frick and furnished an apartment at 419 Franklin Street in Chicago for $115. There were 2 or 3 entries each year, and each time Hoke came to the Marble House with a new wife. His new name was the former married name of the widow he had most recently married or buried. It was Magerstadt's unique role, according to his laborious explanation to the inspector, to be introduced to each one of the wives, listen to her trill of her new romantic bliss, and help her select the furniture for the new love nest. In turn, the doomed brides confided the ultimate details of Hoke's courtship to Magerstadt, that mutual loneliness would now be ended, the asserted need for the companionship of a woman, the old, old song. "With my money," one of the women had told Magerstadt, "and his brains, he'll make a fortune for both of us." It once occurred to Magerstadt, who seems to have been rather slow on the uptake, to ask Hoke why he married under so many different names. Women wouldn't like to marry a man, Hoke had replied logically, and with what may have been a morbid sense of humor, if they knew he had been a widower so many times. Magerstadt, out of curiosity, had actually gone to the funeral of one of Hoke's wives, a Mrs. Julia Steinbecker, who had married Hoke and lasted for 2 months after the wedding ceremony, about par for the course. There had been a fuss at the cemetery. The deceased's family turned up with the coroner and tried to stop the funeral. They claimed she swore on her deathbed that Hoke had poisoned her with a white powder. Hoke produced a death certificate signed by the attending physician, which stated the woman had died of natural causes. He outbluffed the coroner, and his wife was buried. In the course of his researches, Inspector Shippey interviewed Mrs. Martha Hertzfeld, a German widow who had been married in 1894 to Hoke, who was then posing as one Jacob Erdorf, a religious worker. He had told his wife that the bank where she had savings was about to fail. She withdrew her $1,800 and her sister withdrew $800 she had on deposit. Hoke took the money and said that he would put it in another bank under his own name in order to protect it. The sisters were still waiting, in 1898, for him to return from his trip to the bank. Inspector Shippey's investigation alerted the Chicago police to the fact that they probably had a murderer on their hands. They believed, however, that too many years had passed for them to be able to dig up enough concrete evidence to convict the man of murder. The best chance of bringing the killer to justice, it seemed, in Wheeling, and in the clergyman who had been on Hoke's trail. Pastor Haas now took his suspicions, his scrapbook dossier, and his correspondence with the Chicago police to State's Attorney William C. Meyer, Wheeling, West Virginia. The decision was made to exhume the body of Mrs. Carolyn Hoke for autopsy. On November 14, 1898, Mrs. Hoke's grave was opened. The coffin was hoisted out to ground level and its lid pried off. The men leaned over and peered into the pine box. Where the widow's midsection should have been, there was a gaping hole. She had been tidily cut open by a party or parties unknown, her vital organs removed, and along with them any poison they might have contained. Some time before, the Reverend Mr. Haas had remembered that Hoke had claimed to have come from the town of Hochster in Westphalia. The parson had written a letter of inquiry to the mayor of that city, and 2 weeks after the exhumation, he got a reply from Herr Rung, the prosecuting attorney of Mainz, Germany.
Replying to your inquiry of the 4th November 1898 to the mayor of Hochster, Westphalia, we return photo and answer you that the police of Hochster, Brackel, and Dreiberg had no success in finding the man as described in your letter and photo. However, the police of Bingen on the Rhine are positive that this is that of merchant Jacob Schmidt from Herweier near Bingen on the Rhine. Schmidt was born there on November 10th, 1862. He is the son of Adam and Anna Elizabeth Schmidt, and he married Christine Philippine Rahm, by whom he had 4 children. He left his home and country January 5th, 1895, and has since that time been pursued under a warrant charging him with being a fraudulent bankrupt.
This letter temporarily confused the chronology of killer Schmidt-Hoke's activities, which the minister had been working out. The German authorities had the killer immigrating in 1895 to the United States, and the Chicago police, from information supplied by Mungerstadt, the furniture dealer, had Hoke marrying and murdering at least 4 years earlier in June 1891 in Chicago. It remained for Haas, to whom Hoke had become an all-consuming obsession, to iron out any question as to where Hoke may have been operating at any particular time. The minister's research, done entirely by correspondence, worked it out this way. Hoke had been born the son of a German preacher. Apprenticed as a metal worker, he had switched to the study of pharmacy and worked in several chemist shops in Germany, where he got his knowledge of drugs and poisons. He married his first wife, name unknown, in Vienna in 1881 and buried her in 1883. Shortly thereafter, he took wealthy Christine Rahm as his wife. He sired 4 children and then skipped with Christine's savings to a neighboring town where he married again. He used the dowry obtained from this last marriage to finance his trip to America in 1888. It must be reported that Pastor Haas missed a romance enjoyed by Hoke on the boat coming over. In 1905, Frank Winenzer, an employee of a brewery in Chicago, revealed that he came over on the same steamer with Schmidt-Hoke in 1888. Hoke courted an immigrant servant girl aboard ship, married her as soon as the boat landed in New York, absorbed her miserable savings, and buried her 2 months later. Shortly after his arrival in Chicago, Hoke commenced working seriously on his marriages, murders, and swindles. Late in 1894, posing again as a religious worker, Jacob Erdorf, he swindled the Hertzfeld sisters out of $2,600 and used this money to finance a trip back to Germany. In Ehrweiler, he speculated in barley futures and lost heavily. When a note for 3,000 marks fell due, he fled the country a second time in January 1895. A little over a month later, he turned up in Wheeling as Jacob Huff, opened the saloon, and began the campaign that won him the widow Hoke. On June 30th, 1900, this fantastic man was released from jail in Chicago and taken to Wheeling to face a murder charge. Without the widow's vital organs, however, the situation was hopeless. 2 weeks after his arrival in police custody, Hoke was freed for lack of evidence. The parson had brought him extremely close to the point of no return, but not all the way. Immediately after his release, Hoke journeyed to Argos, Indiana, where he introduced himself to a brand new widow, Mrs. Mary Schultz, as Albert Bushberg, a millionaire Chicago druggist. He married the widow, collected a $2,000 insurance policy on her late husband's life, and prevailed upon the widow and her 15-year-old daughter, Nettie, to go back with him to Chicago, where both mother and daughter disappeared, along with $1,500 in savings. This was the first in a new streak of murderous triumphs. At this point, one question begs for an answer. Why didn't Hoke give up his career in wife murder after the law and the Reverend Mr. Haas came so close to fitting his neck for a noose in Wheeling? We can only speculate. It seems doubtful Hoke possessed an arrogance so monumental that he believed he could murder without end and never run afoul of the law. More likely, murder had become a habit. Wife killing was his trade. He could make a living at nothing else. Whatever the reason, Hoke plodded remorselessly on. In 1901, he had hardly buried a widow Lafkin in San Francisco when he began to court the young daughter who had inherited her baking establishment. And this while he was in correspondence with a woman in western New York, had become engaged to a St. Louis woman by mail, and was writing fervent love letters to Mrs. Sophia Reichel in Chicago. Always the pot was kept boiling. Late in 1901, Hoke took a mail-order course in hypnotism given by a professor in Jackson, Michigan. He stuck with the course long enough to earn a diploma, certifying him as a graduate hypnotist. He immediately went to work on a widow named Mrs. Marie Elizabeth Gork, who he met through the room-wanted advertisement he placed in the German language Abendpost in Chicago. He married her in 3 weeks and tried to hypnotize her into taking out a large life insurance policy on her life. The widow was a stubborn, strong-willed woman, one of the few in Hoke's career. When she fell ill, she refused Hoke's offer to nurse her and medicate her with his white powder. Either she got well fast, the widow warned, or she was going to a hospital. Hoke took the hint. He packed his bags and left. There would be other prospects, he was sure, and there were. As the Count Otto von Kern of Bavaria, he swindled the widow Hulda Nagel out of $3,000 in St. Paul in May of 1902. As John Schultz, he married Mrs. Mary Becker, a widow in St. Louis, insured her life, and attended the funeral 2 months later when she succumbed to a sudden illness of 2 days' duration. On June 18, 1903, a strangely familiar and pudgy little man traveling under the name of Dr. G.L. Hart married Mabel Leichman, a burlesque queen of German extraction in Milwaukee. He took her to a Minneapolis home he had rented and unsuccessfully attempted to chloroform her. After a quick getaway in the middle of the night, Dr. Hart, operating once more under the name of Johann Hoke, worked his way for the balance of 1903 and 1904 through a succession of widows that ranged the alphabet from Miss Ada Dodd to Miss Ida Zazul, the former in Dayton and the latter in Milwaukee. Then, late in November of 1904, Hoke returned to his old hunting grounds in Chicago. The move was to prove fatal for Miss Marie Welker, a widow who answered an advertisement that Hoke ran in the Chicago Abendpost on December 3, 1904. Matrimonial, the advertisement invited the unwary Hausfrau, German with his own income, own home, wishes acquaintance of widow without children. Object, matrimony. 9 days after the ad appeared, Hoke led Mrs. Welker to the altar. The afternoon of the wedding, he borrowed all of the blushing bride's ready capital, $475, to furnish her new rented home at 6034 Union Avenue. His own capital, he said, was all tied up in investments and real estate. Overnight, the widow fell ill. She was soon being treated in tandem by a Dr. Reese for what he diagnosed as nephritis, and by Hoke with a white powder for only he knew what. As the widow's condition rapidly became worse, a sister, Mrs. Emily Fisher, who was a widow too, came to visit her. At first, the sisters got along well, and Mrs. Fisher mentioned that she had $1,000 saved that could be used toward paying the medical expenses. Hoke, having better things to do with $1,000, rejected the offer. Somehow, his sick wife got the idea that her sister had put the net out for Hoke and that a romance had begun. "I'll soon be dead," she told Emily Fisher, "and then you can have him." A bitter argument developed, and it was midnight before it ended. It was too late for Emily to go home, and she went down to make her bed on a couch in the kitchen, where Hoke came to visit her and apologized for his wife's accusations. By 5:30 in the morning, they were old friends, and Hoke slipped into his coat and went to fetch the doctor for his wife, whose imprecations seemed to be raining down on their heads with less and less strength. Mrs. Welker was dead when Hoke and the doctor returned. The date was January 12, 1905, 1 month to the day after the marriage of Hoke and the widow. Hoke wept noisily in the kitchen, and Mrs. Fisher had her hands full comforting him. "Now I am a widower again," he cried, "and all alone in the world. I would have spent my entire fortune to have saved her life." Hoke courted Mrs. Fisher throughout the funeral and steadily for the next 4 days. "If Marie had not insulted you with her accusations," he told her, "I would have mourned 6 weeks for her." Under the circumstances, he insisted, they should marry right away. They would open a hotel together and make a fortune. On January 16, 1905, 4 days after the death of her sister, Mrs. Fisher demurely consented to be Hoke's bride. The $1,000 she had mentioned in her sister's sick room was already burning a hole in Hoke's imagination. It would come in handy now, he said. He had an 81-year-old father in Germany who was feeble in health and was about to leave him an estate of $15,000. Didn't Emily think he should go over and protect their interests? Less than a week after the ceremony, Emily advanced $750 to Hoke. That night, he disappeared. Emily thought it over for a couple of days and began to wonder if maybe there wasn't something odd about her sister's death after all. She went to the police, and by one of those remarkable coincidences that plague master criminals, was ushered into the office of Inspector George Shippey, who listened in complete fascination to her story. On January 22, 1905, a court order was obtained for the exhumation of Miss Marie Welker Hoke's body. An autopsy was performed, which showed that the unlucky woman was stuffed with enough arsenic to fell a brewery horse. The search was now on in earnest. This time, the Chicago police had a fresh corpse, and they intended to make the most of it. The case hit the newspapers, and overnight Hoke was a national sensation as more and more of his living ex-wives and the relatives of his dead ones suddenly learned about each other and began telling their stories to the police and reporters. Hoke, however, had disappeared. Calling himself Henry Bartels, he turned up in Manhattan at a boarding house at 546 West 47th Street in answer to a room-for-rent advertisement in the German-language Das Morgen Journal. He rented a hall bedroom and commenced peeling potatoes for the landlady, Mrs. Catherine Kimmerl, a widow of German extraction, within 20 minutes of his arrival. The next day, he proposed marriage in the kitchen while Mrs. Kimmerl was washing the breakfast dishes. Mrs. Kimmerl, not wishing to offend her new boarder, countered by offering to introduce him to the members of the Three Widows Club to which she belonged, some of whom were anxious to take the marital plunge. On Monday morning, January 30th, 1905, Mrs. Kimmerl took a trolley ride downtown. The man sitting opposite her was reading the New York American. On the page facing Mrs. Kimmerl was a picture of the Bluebeard murderer all America was talking about. It was Mrs. Kimmerl's star boarder. She notified the New York police. That night at 10, 4 detectives tiptoed up the stairs to Mrs. Kimmerl's boarding house and into Hoke's room, where they found him calmly rocking himself and smoking a cigar. He did not resist arrest. Among his possessions, the police found 6 $100 bills, 5 fives, loose change in every pocket, a handkerchief that was heavily soaked in cologne, a wedding ring on his finger, and a spare in the trunk with the inscription effaced, a dozen suits with the labels cut out, plus 1 suit with a Cincinnati label and another with a San Francisco label, a loaded revolver, 1 empty new trunk and 2 suitcases, and a hollow fountain pen containing a white powder that turned out to be some 58 grains of arsenic. The prisoner was taken to the 47th Street station house, where he was subjected to round-the-clock questioning. He denied emphatically that he was Johann Hoke, the wanted murderer, claiming that it was a case of mistaken identity. He insisted that he was Henry Bartels, a drummer in Rhine wines for a vintner with home offices in Frankfurt on Main. This pose lasted until a Chicago newspaper woman brought one of his living victims, Mrs. Anna Hendricks Schmidt, to New York to identify him. This was too much even for Hoke. He admitted his identity and unburdened himself of an extraordinary statement. "I am Hoke," said the man who had married some 50 women and murdered at least a third of them. "And I am a much abused man." Hoke Bartels Schmidt was extradited to Chicago for confrontation by those wives of his who were still among the living, an experience that left him unmoved. "Believe me," he told the newspapers, "all those women married me, not because they loved me, but because they thought I was wealthy. They gave me their money because they thought they would receive it back with more." One man who felt he had come to the end of a long trail with the arrest of Hoke was the Reverend Mr. Haas, who had left Wheeling to become pastor of St. Matthew's German Lutheran Church in Utica, New York. Mr. Haas, who was dubbed Hoke's nemesis in the newspaper headlines, gave a lengthy interview to the Hearst papers, telling how the death of Miss Caroline Hoke in Wheeling had put him on the murderer's trail and how he had pursued the villain doggedly ever since. Pastor Haas closed his interview with this stern judgment on his longtime adversary. "I have followed him for 10 years, and I know him to be the biggest scoundrel of the century. Certain it is, whatever may be proven, he is a murderer and a multi-murderer." Hoke went on trial for the murder of Miss Marie Welker Hoke on April 19, 1905, and was found guilty exactly 1 month later. The first words he uttered after getting the verdict were these: "It serves me right." While awaiting execution, Hoke actually received several proposals of marriage. Fortunately, the inexorable possessors of the law saved the authors from their own folly. The multiple murderer was hanged in Chicago's county jail on February 23, 1906. The legacy that Hoke left us, based on his travail as an experienced husband, was summed up in a terse bit of personal advice he gave to a reporter after his arrest. "Women are all right in their place," Hoke said, "but marry only one at a time." As persons who are interested in the most heinous crimes committed against humans throughout history, Johann Hoke does not stand out as unique. There have been many, as demonstrated on this channel, of persons whose sole vocation is to embezzle and swindle their way to a wealthier existence. Indeed, crime does certainly pay, for a while at least, and then like all the other swindlers and heartbreakers, Hoke lost in the end. But this does not deter contemporaries and future Bluebeards from attempting the same game over and over again. If you like what you see, hit the like button, press subscribe, and hit the button so that you'll be notified of any future episodes. Until next time.